Good afternoon. We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tonga and Keech Nation peoples and their neighbors. From north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Kitanamuk, Serrano, Kauia, Peonkawicham, Ohashimen, Ipai Tipai, Kumeyaay, and Quechua peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement, please feel free to visit the acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hunne History Department. We invite you to visit their website, and we'll be putting the link in the chat. And for those of you who are joining us online, we'd love to hear where you're from, so please let us know that as well in the chat. My name is Janice Yu, and I'm the Scheidt Academic Relations and Outreach Officer at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. I'm delighted to welcome those of you here in person and those of you joining us online for this talk. And just a couple of notes about the Zoom protocol for our online audience. So right now you're viewing a side-by-side view of the speaker and the slides that we're sharing. You can make either window larger or smaller by dragging the dividing line between the two windows left or right. We'll have time for questions and discussions following the lecture, so we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll try to get as many questions as time permits. And we'll also be sharing the Q&A with Christine after the talk, so even if your question isn't asked during the talk, she'll have a chance to look at them. We ask that you keep your engagement respectful to the speaker and other attendees. So now to introduce today's lecture and our speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the Associate Director of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Martha Stroud.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you to Janice, Autumn, and Dylan for all your help with this event. We also want to start by thanking the event's co-sponsor, the USC Spatial Sciences Institute. Thank you so much for your cooperation. And yeah. So just to tell you a little bit about the center, for those of you who may not be familiar, since our founding in 2014, the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research has dedicated itself to advancing new areas of interdisciplinary research on genocide and mass violence. We promote research with the unique resources at USC in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, including the Visual History Archive, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies book collection, and the special collections at USC libraries. All of this is in order to transform the ways that we understand the origins, dynamics, and consequences of mass violence, as well as the conditions and dimensions of resistance. The center manages a rich academic program, including international conferences, bestowing numerous fellowships, welcoming visiting scholars, organizing workshops, our lecture series, and offering unique research opportunities. This is our last lecture of the fall semester, which has been pretty quiet on the event front, and it's just because we have allowed you all to store up some energy for next semester when we're going to have 10 lectures. It just worked out that way, the timing, because most of the fellows are coming in the spring or are finishing their fellowships in the fall. So we look forward to seeing you often in person for delicious lunches. Those of you online are missing an epic lunch from Porto's Bakery, delicious lunches, and stimulating research. So we look forward to seeing you every other week next semester. So we're here today for the lecture of our 2025-2026 Robert J. Katz Research Fellow in Genocide Studies. This fellowship is named after former USC Shoah Foundation Board of Counselors Chair and longtime volunteer Robert J. Katz in recognition of his service to the Shoah Foundation. First bestowed in 2016, this fellowship enables an advanced standing PhD candidate from anywhere in the world to spend up to a month at USC at the center to work with the unique resources here at USC. The fellowship has supported 10 international graduate students since its inception. The 9th and the 10th are both in the room, which is delightful. And applications are currently open for the next cycle of fellowships. So if you're inspired, please go to our website to learn more about that opportunity. And now, to our speaker for today. The 2025-2026 Katz Research Fellow in Genocide Studies, Christine Liu, is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Maine. She earned a BA in history from the University of California, Berkeley, biased, working on the history of Japanese American internment and the life of artist Ruth Asawa. She earned an MA in computational media from Duke University, where her thesis focused on mapping and visualizing testimonies of spaces of confinement in the Krakow Ghetto. Christine also served as the Digital Humanities Associate Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She worked as a research assistant on the Holocaust Ghettos project and the Placing the Holocaust project in the Digital and Spatial History Lab at the University of Maine, supporting center-affiliated scholar Professor Ann Knowles. Her research on starvation as a tool of war and mass violence is unfortunately all too timely. Please join me in welcoming Christine Liu.
Thanks, Martha. So hello, everyone. Of course, I have to say thank you to everyone at the center, Wolf, Martha, Janice, and Autumn, and the grad students from the history department for who've made it so nice and welcoming to work here over the last few weeks. I'm prone to lurking from my desk in the center, but as a PhD candidate out in the wild in the dissertating phase, it has been so very nice to return to a place with a sense of community. And I thank everyone in the room and online, of course, for taking time out of your day. Just to say, I am also a Southern California native, and I grew up 20 odd or so miles away from here, so it's been fun to imagine what it would have been like if I had made different choices at the age of 17, but sorry, go Bears. But today I will be giving a sort of work in progress overview of my dissertation, even as I mentally race towards the reality of the slog of actually writing the thing. I realize that this is my first time presenting about my research, besides in conversations with friends, colleagues, and of course my advisor, Ann Knowles. So thank you everyone again in advance for your presence, attention, feedback, and hopefully ideas. So my project investigates or argues this core idea that hunger fundamentally defined experiences of the space of Holocaust ghettos, with the Łódź ghetto as my area of study. What I am interested in is not necessarily just descriptions of ghetto organizations or food distribution networks, which I will still introduce today, or how hunger was built into the expansion or colonization plans of the Third Reich. But I am looking at how starvation conditions changed social relations, were crucial to the maintenance of ghetto territoriality, and altered how spaces were experienced. So the early swirlings for this began years ago when I was working on a different project thinking about digital historical visualizations. So in that, I was looking at stories from survivors of the Krakow ghetto, and I was interested in how people interacted with the built boundaries, so the walls in the ghettos built to contain bodies within the space. And I was intrigued by stories like one where a survivor recounts their mother baking a makeshift cake and offering it to a guard to distract them so that the child could sneak out and purchase things on the black market. And it was astounding and almost absurd to me, the compiling these like excerpts, hard to get goods, willingly interacting with the guard, the risk of getting caught. And it made me question, like, what drove individuals to take on risky, transgressive, or dangerous actions? And the answer to me was hunger. So hunger, so ubiquitously experienced during the Holocaust, is for me a key aspect to drawing us closer to understanding how these historic spaces functioned and existed. And originally, my plan was to think literally about where food distribution took place, where crimes associated with foodstuffs were captured, create a data set, throw it on a map, and see where it led me. And the archive didn't yield what I hoped it would, and I had to pivot and push to where I am today and what we'll talk about today. And I still hold up hope that one day, talking about this failure to launch this original idea, will have someone come up and say, like, actually, this is where the archive is. Here it is. And then I can go plug away on a GIS software, but I digress. And there are two important areas to go over first, one being hunger, and two being the concept of space and place. As I mentioned, I am not necessarily studying conditions of famine, but I do want to acknowledge that there are many different terms that are used to describe and label different levels of or different conditions of food scarcity. There's food shortage, food poverty, food deprivation, and famines have been classified into different stages of development. And how these terms are applied can be dependent on the field of study or even organization from which you might be reading literature from. And hunger can be clinically defined as, quote, the inadequacy in dietary food intake relative to the kind of quantity of food required for growth, physical and mental activity, and for the maintenance of good health. And there are a lot of physiological demands and effects that are easier to quantify, while the psychological effects are, of course, impossible to calculate. In this study and today's talk, I might use the word hunger, food deprivation, and starvation interchangeably to speak broadly on the conditions on the ground and their effects and individual responses. And for people in the room and maybe at home with their own lunch in front of them, I won't be going into any of the nitty-gritty details, so you should be able to proceed with your lunch in peace. And for moving on to space and place, so for geographer Yi-Fu Tuan, place is a pause in movement that makes it possible for a locality to become a center of felt value. He argues that space and place require one another to be defined. It is the contrast between the two that allows the other to be possible. So if place is a break, space is freedom. It's the power to act and transcend a present condition. And his conceptions of space and place are not concrete, but it's exactly this elusive nature of these notions that I think allows scholars to study geographies in such broad and fluid ways. For many scholars like Tuan, place is socially constructed and operating. Yet the processes by which placemaking and meaning are constructed can also be further broken into various scales, as I do. Though Tuan's work operates on the notion that place is static, the meaning of places can change and is often in flux. The Łódź ghetto would have been a space and a place. So for German perpetrators designating its boundaries, it was a space on a map, lines drawn. The oppression of unwanted populations in newly occupied territory adds to the sense of national placemaking for the relocated population. For its German residents, the ghetto was still a space unknown and familiar, maybe the first day that they moved in. For those from the outside, the ghetto could have felt like a temporary stop or reprieve after a prolonged period of uncertainty and displacement. The Łódź ghetto was placed in a historically Jewish part of the city. It was designated as a Jewish space by the Germans, yet Jews ultimately could not control or own it. And when we speak about Holocaust places, iconic names or places like Auschwitz or Warsaw might come to mind. These identifiable, familiar, mappable, placeable places. Yet many of the most important events of the Holocaust occurred in unnamed places. Ordinary places such as city streets, forests, and domestic homes were transformed by occupation and systematic violence. Though many of these places are unnamed and locationally ambiguous, their omnipresence throughout post-war testimonies emphasize their importance. And here I just have a slightly annotated excerpt from a testimony that highlights the prevalence of how these named and unnamed places might coexist in even such a short excerpt as 2 sentences. While I will spend more time introducing the Łódź Ghetto today, this approach to thinking about the more unplaceable and anonymous Holocaust spaces is what informs the crux of my approach to studying the so-called geography of hunger in this ghetto, and a type of space in which some individuals were able to maintain the last vestiges of normal life among other Jews' loved ones, and sometimes in places already familiar to them, is what drives my interest. And I directly borrow and rephrase some lines that geographer James Tyner wrote for his own work that looks at the relationship between space and violence, to say that I want to understand the space and place of the ghetto from the standpoint of hunger, and I want to understand hunger in the ghetto from the standpoint of geography. So during the rest of our time today, I will introduce the Łódź Ghetto and how foodstuffs were distributed and used, including how I conceptualize of the space of the ghetto, not just as an area outlined on a map, but reinforced. Then a slightly more narrative introduction to how I have broken my project into the scale of the ghetto, the streets, and the home, and how I have been reading/listening for the intersection of hunger and space in survivor memoirs and testimonies. And finally, an overview of some work yet to be done and maybe some light prodding for what things I might want to discuss in the Q&A section. But the Łódź Ghetto, so after September, going back to the map, after September 1939, occupied Poland was divided into 2 parts, territories incorporated directly into the Third Reich and then the General Government. Located roughly 75 miles southwest of Warsaw, Łódź was eventually incorporated into Wartegau and annexed into the Reich. This is a city that saw rapid growth in the mid-19th century as a center of textile manufacture, and it had the second largest Jewish population in Poland, with almost 250,000 Jews living in the city before German occupation. The city was subject to intense Germanization. It was renamed Litzmannstadt, and its street names and public spaces were given German names. Non-German residents faced physical attacks, detention, looting, forced labor at the hands of their occupiers, and Jews were especially targeted for a myriad of further abuses. Nazi restrictions on Jewish bank accounts limited the amounts that people could have on hand or even withdraw. So individuals and families who were reliant on suddenly denied funds or pensions or lacking the belongings to sell or exchange were suddenly at the risk of starvation quite early on. As people across Poland responded to the invasion by stockpiling resources, food prices soared, and those with limited resources immediately began to feel their effects. Jewish businesses were plundered, and by November 1939, directly expropriated by the state. Despite increasingly dire financial and material circumstances, Jews were nevertheless further excluded from soup kitchens or breadlines that were set up by Germans. Mandated to wear self-identifying yellow armbands and markings on their clothes, any German could recognize a Jew in the street, and this obviously facilitated the daily kidnappings, thefts, and persecutions. The danger of being caught in a food queue without self-identifying could be just as dire as the fear of being discovered trying to pass as a non-Jew in public. And changes in Jewish life under German occupation were quick and expedient. There was an early order that forbade Jews from walking on streets, even almost exclusively home to Jewish residences. Jews were prohibited from moving residences without permission, forbidden in most public spaces, and banned from traveling in any form of public transportation. So freedom of movement was restricted with a rapidity that really narrowed areas of relative safety to certain distances from their homes. And in December 1939, there was an official order to establish the ghetto in Łódź. The ghetto was bounded by a wooden and barbed wire fence before being officially sealed off in late April. There were post and station members of the German police every 50 to 100 meters and additional guards from auxiliary police forces as needed. Furthermore, the German criminal police was in charge of combating illegal contact between the ghetto and the Aryan side, mainly through smuggling. And the Germans tore down buildings adjacent to the ghetto boundaries and created a no man's land between the fence and the Aryan side of the city. It would have been better to include a map that showed the ghetto situated in the city as a whole, but city center is like mostly down here. And then I'll mention it further, but then when I say there's a tram line, this is where it goes. The Łódź ghetto is regarded as the most isolated of ghettos, hermetically sealed and cut off from outside information. With few exceptions, Jews in the ghetto were not sent out to work in the city. As a result, there was almost no communication between the people in the ghetto and the residents. As characterized by survivor Saul Cohn, quote, "There were no barbarities per se carried out in the ghetto. That's where they took the people in all these actions and took them someplace. And we had no idea where they took them to, where they went. Very often they managed to convince us that these people they were taking were really going for some productive work." Despite the stymied flow of information into the ghetto, both residents of the city and those in the ghetto still encountered each other with relative ease. There was no way to deny the existence of an incarcerated community within Łódź. So tram lines carried Poles and Germans onto the city's major streets through the ghetto. If ghetto residents needed to cross the streets, they used wooden footbridges that were raised 25 feet above the ground. These bridges made an impression in many survivors' descriptions of the ghetto. They could look down at the trams that passed through the ghetto every day as passengers made commutes. And Frank Harry H. Schiller described how, quote, "As you got weaker, that became an ever greater effort to climb the bridge on one side and walk down the other." These tram thoroughfares, referred to by Adam Siderak, can be seen as zones of extraterritoriality, where German spaces that bisected the Jewish ghetto. Geographer Robert Sack maintains that the concept of territoriality is a means of reifying power. Power and influence are not always tangible. They are potentialities. Territoriality makes potentials explicit and real by making them visible. The act of delineating areas is not enough to create a territory, but the delineated space does become a territory when its boundaries are used to affect behavior by controlling areas. The Jewish Order Service maintained the border from the inside and enforced bans on individuals leaving the ghetto. The official rhetoric or propaganda that was used to justify the space was that Jewish bodies needed to be quarantined to protect the general public from fear of disease. And as starvation beset the ghetto, people weakened, and the ghetto population did experience several waves of epidemics that seemed to affirm this technique of pathologizing undesirability through bodily difference. Curiously enough, some like Hania Reinhardt's expressed relief at being in a ghetto from the outset, despite the hunger and disease, because, quote, "At least we did not have to look at the faces of the Nazis. We no longer had to get off the sidewalk. I was surrounded by my friends, and we all became citizens of the ghetto." If the physical boundaries erected around the ghetto were not enough, it could have been the sounds and sights of former neighbors carrying on with their lives that reminded Jews that what had become part of their everyday life was not normal. And they faced dire realities in the ghetto. While the ghetto officially covered roughly 4 square kilometers, when areas designated for non-residential uses are discounted, only slightly less than 2.5 square kilometers were actually available for the initial population of 164,000. And the majority of the area's residential units consisted of only single or double or 2 rooms, and about 95%, roughly 30,000 units, had no sewage plumbing facilities. So on average, there should have been 3.5 persons packed into each of these 48,000 rooms, though in actuality, space is not distributed evenly, and as many as 15 to 20 people could have been crowded into one room. Some apartments might have been lucky to have their own stoves, while others had to share communal kitchens. Tied to the problem of having food was also the difficulty of having the means to cook and to actually heat things, or heat the home itself. As Ann Tausk recalls, people broke up everything from wooden staircases and even the board laying across walkways. Whatever anybody could break, whatever anybody could use for burning, we all broke up. And in some dire cases, for those living on upper levels of apartment buildings, such as Mary Nathan's family, she recalled that during the winter of 1941, when it was so cold that ice formed on the walls of the apartment, quote, slowly the staircase was disappearing, and we were afraid we'll be prisoners in the apartment, and we won't be able to come down, so my father started looking for another place. So the ghetto was administered by a Jewish council led by Chaim Rumkowski. Food had to be paid for in advance to the German ghetto administration, yet the money sent for food was often embezzled, or worse yet, the food simply not delivered. The ghetto administration often had their requests for food deliveries refused. They might have faced delays or discovered that shipments contained less than what they paid for. The frequent fluctuation in food supply were unpredictable. Diaries from the time would record surprise shipments of goods and complaints when announced rations were never arrived. The supply of food was never enough to meet the administration or the population's demands. The supply of food was distributed through a variety of ways throughout the ghetto's existence. Soon after the ghetto was sealed in 1940, there were house committees that collected money to pay for rations, and the ghetto had its own currency that was worthless outside of the ghetto. A system ran concurrently with private restaurants, shops, and bakeries of sorts, and the simultaneous existence of multiple food purchasing options, even in the face of high unemployment, was meant to extract wealth from the Jews incarcerated in the ghetto. And by the summer of 1940, the ghetto was starving. There was a unique social structure that fell under Rumkowski. At the level directly below were the heads of workshops, departments, police members, and courts. And following this group were the instructors, skilled workers, and those who performed heavy labor. The majority of the ghetto population came next, with those unfit or unable to work rounding out the bottom level. One's place in this hierarchy was determinant of their privilege. Most importantly, it affected the quantity and quality of supplemental rations that one might have received. While it can be argued the actual amount of privilege was negligible, it's a question of grams of sugar or bread, in terms of how much their starvation conditions could be alleviated by the imbalanced distribution of official rations. Yet it was the perception of corruption, obvious when an individual might have been given their allocation without having to wait, that did more to affect the general morale and constant state of tension that reverberated throughout. A distribution system of bread and food ration cards was instituted in late 1940 and changed subsequently throughout the years, with a 5-day, 2-kilogram loaf of bread distribution, which rendered it difficult for bread distributors to dole out unequal portions. In reality, people often consumed their bread within the first 2 or 3 days and relied on daily servings of soup received at work or in a community kitchen. There were 2 further contractions in the bread rations in 1941. In September, the same loaf of bread now had to last for 6 days, and November, after an influx of deportees from Western Europe, caused the daily allocation to decrease once again. Germans did not increase the food allocations to the ghetto despite the sudden population growth, wherein suddenly the same food supply was meant to sustain a population that had grown by 20%. After a period of violent and intense deportation that removed most of the ghetto's children, elderly, and infirmed, Hans Bibo, the German ghetto administrator, assumed a more direct control of the ghetto in September 1942. The ghetto was reorganized into a forced labor camp, and he created a special unit of ghetto police with additional responsibilities that included distribution of food. By late 1943, he canceled a number of supplemental foods for groups like ghetto administrators and instead offered supplements to top workers. The ghetto began to be liquidated in August 1944. And with the historical basis established, I'm going to pivot a bit. So in my project, I've broken up my study into 3 scales, as I mentioned: the ghetto as a whole, the streets, and the home. And because there's not enough detail to go into any single one today with super detail, the following section I hope to provide, like I said, a more narrative overview about how I'm reading and listening for space and hunger in my resources. During my research, I found resonance in a new to me subfield of carceral geography, which studies carceral spaces as a type of geography of internal and external social and spatial relationships. One aspect that I'm reminded to think about is time. Sometimes that can be difficult to pace, yet time is intimately tied to space. Time itself can be considered a form of punitive action. Think of the train journey suddenly made endless due to the lack of information about the intended destination or travel time. The countless hours waiting in queues for food or rations. In interviews with survivors, interviewees will often be explicitly asked to recount their memories of seeing Rumkowski on the streets or the September 1942 deportations, which sent 15,000 Jews to Chelmno. Among many other things I wish interviews might ask about, what I sometimes want to hear about is actually a change to the work schedule in September 1942, where the work schedule was changed to a 12-hour workday, 6 days a week. In an article published in the Chronicle of the Ghetto, which was a near-daily bulletin published during the ghetto's existence, an author wrote about the effects that this change might have taken upon life in the ghetto. Suddenly, there seemed to be a nightlife. Whereas previously families consisting of several members with different work hours had chance to pick up their rations during the day, or single persons could leave for work during brief periods. In short, things changed because of this change to the labor schedule. One way or another, you bore the heavy burden of ghetto life. Yet there was a constant flow of foot traffic in the streets, and visiting commissions could simply not understand why the streets and shops were crowded with people during working hours. But now this torrent of tired, hungry workers pours into the street all at once at 5 p.m. and not before. The schedule is as follows. You pick up your rations, prepare supper, clean up the apartment, which you left in most cases shortly after 6 a.m. That is when it was still dark, so that the various bucket chores, the wood and coal, etc., are waiting for you when you return. So everyone wants to get home as fast as possible, picking up rations on the way. Consequently, people rush to the distribution shops to avoid having to be out in the snow, wet, and cold late at night. The commotion outside and inside the shops, which are open from 5 p.m. to midnight, is not only indescribable, but dangerous to life and limb. So time in the ghetto was tied to hunger. In interviews, survivors frequently remark on the length of time they were expected to make their rations last. Individuals wrote of telling time by duration remaining until their next meal. Dahlia has offered characterizations of this as a type of rhythm of family life. The proper rhythm were those who managed to only eat a portion each day. But not everybody could, and by the last days, families were living in agony over expectation and tension. The hours spent in ration queues was troubling. It meant more hours spent outside, exposed to the elements, the possibility of violence, and being trapped in a roundup. The Chronicle describes the pitiful sight of those lucky enough to get a certain allotment of turnips as struggling to drag bags of the heavy vegetables down the streets. Rita Wilson describes the difficulty of the winter in the ghetto. Quote, "We had to collect stuff for 4 people, so we couldn't carry them home alone, and we wouldn't dare to let anyone else carry them because they could disappear with that stuff. So sometimes we had to stay several nights in line to bring partial rations." While in bed from pneumonia and dysentery, Eva Lubitsky's Orthodox father spent hours queuing and attempting to trade for food and medicine to help his only child, even managing to procure opium to relieve her pain. Lubitsky recalls that her father's traditional dress, quote, precluded him from standing in line, making him an obvious target of violence, and that she had no idea how he managed such a feat during the period she was incapacitated with illness. Yet, a wait didn't always guarantee success either. In her interview, Ann Taus recounted the disappointment of her brother waiting in line to get potatoes. She characterized food queues as situations where the stronger were pushing to the front and people were always fighting. And she recalls a time when her mother and the family was at home when the brother went out to get rationing for some potatoes. Her mother boiled the water in advance so that when he came home, they could cook right away. But he came home empty-handed and crying. We were all crying. There was the water boiling, but there was nothing to put into it. And tensions did not end just because foodstuffs were secured. Some families pulled resources like flour, sugar, and vegetables to make more nourishing meals or soups. Yet bread usually remained a highly valued individual commodity. Henry Sperling's family employed a tactic of trying to retrieve just one family member's ration allotment at a time so that bread would not get too old or stale, and they could better attempt to control their pace of consumption. As he candidly shares, "Sure, I could have taken the ration, eat everything up today, and for the next week I didn't have what to eat, and somebody would give me anything. There was no place to go to kill somebody. I mean, that's the only thing." While Eva Lubitsky struggled to make her loaf of bread last, her mother always meticulously maintained each day's portion. There was a day when she returned home before her mother and became obsessed with the knowledge of her mother's loaf of bread. The cabinet within which that loaf of bread was kept became a place of conflict and temptation within the interior safety of their shared home. Despite the fact that her mother suffered from rickets, a decalcification caused by calcium and vitamin D deficiency that racked many in the ghetto, Lubitsky stole a sliver of bread. Racked with guilt and disbelief at her own conduct, she writes in her memoirs about the enduring guilt that she lived with. Quote, "Others behaved the same way or even worse toward their loved ones. There was no clearer sign to me that the Germans had broken our spirit as well as our bodies." Despite this transgressive moment, Lubitsky and her mother were able to preserve their commitment to one another, especially after her father died. But not all families or households were able to maintain such bonds regardless of pre-war closeness or sense of social care. Proximity mattered. After Eva Hoffman's father was deported from the ghetto, she and her mother were forced to move into a room of another apartment already occupied by a family of 3. Hoffman recalled that, quote, "They hated us, like it was our fault that they put us into their houses, and they were really mean to us." Even though the shared household had the fortune of a stove to share in their apartment, the mother of the other family would put out the cooking fire each time she was finished and force Hoffman's mother to use up precious resources to start another fire. In her testimony, Bluma Rosen shares that her father lived with her older sister Chaya and Chaya's 4 kids in the ghetto. She describes the children as, quote, "totally subservient to their hunger, and nothing else penetrated their minds. They finished their food the day they received it, then they stayed in bed until the next ration, writhing in hunger." Rosen's father did not receive rations because he was too elderly to work, so she herself asked for overtime to receive more soup. When the soup was brought to her father, Rosen describes being watched by 2 nephews, with their drooping mouths and flaming hungry lips, who seemed to swallow with every time that she brought the spoon to the lips of the elderly man. Chaya never said anything to her children, only standing in a corner, quote, looking forlornly from her children to her father. And as Rosen herself could not meaningfully divide the soup into additional portions, in her testimony, she describes how the picture of my sister and her hungry children never left my mind's eye. The close intimacy of a family member caring for a parent was jeopardized by the lack of privacy in the apartment, where the aide to Rosen's father was a source of tension between the multi-generational members of the family, witnessed on every occasion through multiple senses. Rosen even mentions covering the pot of soup with a towel, lest her own empty stomach be tempted. The man's starvation elicited this sacrificial act of care from Rosen, yet drew a rift between herself and a sister who could neither contribute to the man's care and survival, but also had to watch food that could have alleviated her own children's hunger be given to another. And it's been helpful for me to think about the ghetto as a space that is designed to be restrictive in nature. Holocaust ghettos, unlike prisons and concentration camps, tended to repurpose existing buildings or parts of cities rather than build entirely new settlements. They existed within rules and practices separate from the system from which they were built from. or into, despite their often close proximity to the so-called normal society. Scholars like Leonard Baer and Bodil Ravneberg have acknowledged in their study of Norwegian and English prisons that geographers have a tendency to default to Irving Goffman's classic definition of sites like mental institutions, army camps, concentration camps, and prisons, among others, as total institutions. For Goffman, a total institution is a place of residence and work where a large number of like-minded individuals, cut off from wider society for an appreciable period of time, together lead an enclosed, formally administered round of life. And this tendency to understand such sites as total institutions paints an image of isolated spaces, when in fact it is impossible to achieve total confinement. Even walled ghettos like those in Krakow and Łódź had constant movement through its built boundaries. For example, tram cars that ran through the ghetto, the people that were transferred or deported from one place to another, and even the goods and utilities that flowed through the ghetto's gates. Social networks and exchanges also continually flow beyond visible borders. An absolutely impermeable space cannot be maintained, yet studies of carceral spaces implicitly depend on binaries like inside-outside, free or not free, open or closed, here or there. The most simple slide. Discussing the organization of life within the space of the Łódź ghetto offers a glimpse into a distorted sense of confined living that operated in parallel to the vestiges of a community that long predated German occupation. So Baer and Ravneberg also build on Foucault's concept of heterotopia. For Foucault, utopias are sites that are with no real place. They invert or perfect the real space of society, but they're fundamentally unreal. Foucault characterizes heterotopias as sites that are real places designed into the very institution of society that they might seem entirely unrelated to, but coexist and they're symbolic of the rest of society. So he references places like cemeteries, museums, libraries, even brothels, as places that have a certain return effect akin to looking at a mirror, in which an image reflected in a mirror appears to be another space, though the person or object reflected remains in its own inhabited space. So a person might look inside and see the outside, and the two become entangled in memory, explanation, and even reality. So conceptualizing of Holocaust ghettos as heterotopias rather than total institutions thus has the effect of underscoring the fact that these ghettos exist in a broader framework of societal order and structure, so they're not entirely separate. There were spaces inside the ghetto and the space outside the ghetto, the streets that both separated and linked the places within, and the homes that functioned as places of both insecurity and security. Thinking like this helps me to ponder questions like, what did Łódź represent as a ghetto within a larger system? What does this say about German-occupied Poland? It also calls to mind a series of binaries and assumptions about spaces that I think I often take for granted, explored in the literature that I speak of and in discussions of spaces generally. Again, inside, outside, public, domestic, safety, danger, home, and street. And complicating these assumptions through the lens of hunger draws towards understanding how these spaces were experienced. Ghettoization forced the Jewish community into spatial configurations that made it very difficult to evade abuse and violence. People were no longer able to navigate space freely. The fear of violence and starvation changed the way the environment was perceived and navigated, but the threat of hunger necessitated that this fear be overcome or negotiated. And looking ahead, there are things that I'd rather, I think, elegantly bring up right now before moving forward, not as a cop-out, but as an acknowledgement and hopeful invitation for suggestion and discussion. And one big one is my rather glaring omission directly of the topic of labor. Or for my project, I think it would be the spaces of labor, such as factory floors, sites where food was actually distributed on site, especially when labor is so central to the logic behind prolonged ghettoization and the organization of the Łódź ghetto itself. And for me, looking at spaces of forced labor feels like another entirely additional or different project, though obviously access to foodstuffs through labor and the ever presence of forced labor, especially in Łódź, was so intrinsic to survival in the ghetto. And I've yet to be able to clearly define where the boundaries of my study may lay, though I've started to attempt to formulate my own dictionary of places of hunger in the Łódź ghetto, some of which we've discussed today, being the footbridge, the cabinet within a home, the kitchen, and even a bread queue. In one amazing testimony, a survivor recalls laying under the leaves of a crop of beets that were grown in a small patch between a courtyard of buildings in order to avoid detection during a roundup. And these are these minute spaces or places that I would never think of yet, or it would be impossible to place onto a map, yet they're worth considering and thinking about why it would exist in the first place. And like most historians, I am also guilty of using photographs to dress up a presentation. And the Łódź ghetto is remarkably well documented. We have a really special photographic archive with images created for propaganda use and images that were taken seemingly for private consumption. Often this genre of this latter category shows the inner lives of the elite within the ghetto, Romkowski and his cohort, Jewish police and their families. And they're astounding in that life sometimes looks normal in them. This is not one of them. We have images of kids celebrating their birthdays in front of tables laden with treats in a time when children were rare in the ghetto. Families enjoying time together in a nice garden area in the privileged area of Maryshin, which is in the top right corner of the map I had shown. That looks like a green space. It was adjacent to the Jewish cemetery or it looks like open green space on a map, yet other witnesses have described them as brown, muddy pits or areas. So there's a dichotomy of just how people remember the space depending on their access to it. There's also existing scholarship that looks at images from a variety of angles. While I've done, I think, plenty of reading and listening to get to some of the work I've introduced today, I think I do need to also do a bit more looking at where a lot of these commonly described actions might have taken place, where are the blind spots from my current perspective, and taking for granted what I imagine when I think of a soup kitchen, or where somebody might have received their soup allotment, when it might look like this rather than an enclosed interior space that I think we are more used to thinking about. Potato peels became a commodity in the ghetto, fried together as makeshift pancakes used to thicken soup. They even become prescribed as by doctors to those who were ill in need of extra nourishment. So survivors speak of looking for discarded peels or cuttings from other vegetables. But looking at the caption for this photo, what did that actually look like? Where were they? And what were the physical and the psychological fallout of having to transition to securing food in this way? So hunger is an altered state. It was and is used as weapon of genocide and mass violence. It can sharpen the senses or fracture the mind, and it is clear that extreme hunger destroys bodies and communities. By examining hunger during the Holocaust, my project seeks to further avenues of spatial thinking in Holocaust research. I hope to contribute to scholarship on gender identity, social relations, carceral geographies, and questions about space and place at a moment when these questions do feel pertinent. And that by applying geographic concepts of space and place to demonstrate that experience of Holocaust ghettos were fundamentally defined by hunger in reshaping social ties, communal relations, and defining these places. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Over here. We're going to start the Q&A now. Thank you, Christine.
Okay.
No, you can stay here. I'm going to take the computer away. We are going to switch to the microphone in the sky. So for those of you in the room who are asking questions, please project your voices so the people online can hear you. And for those of you online, Dylan will be looking at the Q&A and asking your questions here in the room. Thank you for that, Dylan. So thank you.
Yes. So, thank you for an amazing presentation. This was absolutely fascinating. I was wondering if you could speak a little on, have you noticed any impacts on gender roles within the ghetto based on hunger, or like any impacts on like gender perceptions or how survivors are framing that to themselves in their testimonies at all?
Yeah, that was also a big part of my project that I admitted today because I'm more confident that it works. Whereas some of the stuff today, I'm like feeling out the vibes for it. But gender roles were very much affected by starvation. It comes out in a variety of ways. So one being when men may be unable to work, or women suddenly being thrown out into the workforce. Men oftentimes found their roles of head of household destabilized, and sometimes when either parent of either gender wouldn't rise to the occasion, that is often also a real difficult thing for families to navigate. We have stories of women wanting to divorce husbands because they might have been taking food from the family rations, or wanting to move away from their husband, but they have to secure divorce. And we even have a story, I think in a chronicle, of an 8-year-old child who accuses his family of withholding his rations from him, and saying that they should be punished. And then obviously also like bread queues. I think they're just so, or not bread, but all ration queues, but I'm just so fascinated by the way that society plays out in them when you're sending out women and children because men might be more targeted to be grabbed for like certain like short-term labor or just whatever, something like that. So you have children waiting in long queues, and that just changes the dynamics of who is responsible for what within a household. And some families rise to the occasion and some don't. And it's very interesting in seeing how sometimes even women sometimes mentally fall apart if they lose a member of their family, and then how kids sometimes have sympathy maybe for a mother going through a period of crisis, and how some recover and some don't, and maybe sometimes even choose to deport from the ghetto so that and just sort of tricked by the promise of better resources elsewhere. Yes.
Thanks so much for this. There's so much that came up for me listening. I was struck by this the inclusion of time and temporality.
Yeah.
Which I think is like a great move to make. And I was thinking about it particularly in relation to this comment at the end where you're discussing kind of the phenomenology of hunger as an altered state, how it affects the mind and the body, sometimes surprisingly, but very different ways depending on the human it's affecting. Right? And I was thinking about how that kind of offers a way into potentially like a possible geography of spatial freedom, right? Of the freedom or constriction of spatial access, right? Or exploration, or spontaneity.
Yeah.
That like the physical body as it declines, right? Just as it kind of through this reverse metabolization is less active, its kind of range decreases, right? And the further constriction of the superimposition of the social or political geography of containment or social control, right? And how those axes overlap potentially, right? And it's not something that you can find data on, but I think that you've done such a good job in pulling little bits of testimony that are providing kind of these anecdotes of certain features of life that you can use to build a speculative geography of hunger, right? And I think a lot also in relation to the piece about time of the work of some Israeli and Palestinian geographers on the fragmentation of space in the West Bank and time. There's this book called by Adi Ophir, who's an Israeli geographer. It's an edited volume. It's called Power, Inclusive Exclusion. And there's an essay in there about, based on the testimonies of pregnant Palestinian women trying to get to hospitals in order to give birth, and passing their experience of passing through checkpoints, right?
Yeah.
It goes from there to thinking about how there is a connected archipelago of settlement with roads, with an infrastructure, and then existing alongside that or underneath it often are these networks of Palestinian roads and movement, and how to get through the same amount of abstract space takes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times as long for Palestinians as it would for the famous images of the overpass over the like dirt Palestinian road, which was, I mean, and I wouldn't make comparisons might be, but this pedestrian footbridge that goes over in the city might be exactly so explicitly as that kind of thing. So, and then I guess the last thing, to your point about labor and industry, I was thinking about this a lot too, and like the question, where is the heterogeneity here? But like I think even more interesting and possibly more available in the archive would be to look at previous, and you mentioned that this city experienced a population boom as a result of the industrialization around textiles. So previous industrial geography that existed that was selectively appropriated by the Nazis who didn't keep all the factories open, but they kept some of them open. And then so you have this new re-intensification or selective intensification of previously existing industrial production, and then some of it closed and reappropriated. So I mean, maybe there's something there in looking at what how the city was organized industrially around that kind of logic before the Nazis arrived, and then possible to understand how they shift things or how those factories change. Struck by this comment where someone says, "We just thought they were taking us off to work." Right? And in an industrial city where people are used to working, it's just that seems the way that interacts with the geography of hunger is really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment and suggestions, and picking up on the phenomenology of hunger. I was briefly obsessed with trying to crack Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who writes about the phenomenology of experience in the body, but so theory is not my forte, and I'm obsessed with the idea of how we can locate the body as a place as well and carry experiences, especially something as visceral as this. And I've yet to crack it, but there's still time. And it's interesting that you mentioned the connected archipelago, because just to add before we move on, but the first reading that I did that made me aware carceral geography as a field of study existed was one about the Soviet Union. And it was this article, or this chapter about the train journey into Siberia and the archipelago that was connected to prison camps, and how the train journey was part of the punitive action experience. And it's just, I saw so much resonance with this period of history as well.
It's a traffic business.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Gary Opper, who's online, has a question. He asks, can you discuss the context of the last photograph of the men looking for food while being photographed? Propaganda, perhaps?
I'm actually not entirely sure about that. That's one of the fun parts of being on campus was walking around the stacks of the Holocaust collections in the Doheny Library, and I have seen images from the ghetto before, mostly online, but I picked up this book that was that was all in German, and there were a lot of new to me images that reminded me of the fact that I do need to do this work and to look more. It could have been for propaganda use, but I can't actually give you more context on that. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much for an incredible talk. Thank you so much for an incredible talk. I just had talk about hunger and mapping on the body. I think that's going to be so interesting because I hope I crack it. I think there is totally a way to do that. I think you've already spoken about how hunger changes both the physiology and the psychology of a human and of the body, and I think the ways in which that's changing in both public and private spaces in the ghetto is so important. So I feel there's a threads of it there that I think I'm excited to hear you how you pull on them. But I also had a question that was kind of related to this idea of binaries that you presented, and I was curious in ways how you're also thinking about how hunger or whether hunger itself is or isn't a binary category of analysis. Like, because I think you've done a really great job of showing how people talk about like the character of hunger and how that changes. But obviously, it's not like you aren't hungry before the ghetto and then you experience hunger in it and then the hunger stops after, right? Like it's constantly, the character is constantly changing and this is just kind of one site where the character of hunger is defined by the space. I just have more thoughts on that.
Ooh, Charlotte, that's such a good question. I've actually never thought about that. The binaries that I think about have mostly applied to our assumption for how we might think about space. From my perception of what I've thought about so far, hunger and the experience of it, I almost feel like there is no clear beginning, middle, or end. There's just different levels of it. Even like hunger on the body, as we've kind of been discussing in the room, like mental space is the place that I can see it, ironically can't place it, but see it so clear and potent in the way that people talk about how they're obsessed. They dream about it, they think about it, even literature about social relations in like concentration camps. We have women sharing stories of what they used to cook in life before. And that's, the mental space is one of those unmappable places that, you know, in like other projects we've discussed, and I do want to delve into that more. And I find it so interesting because it is so obvious to me as a place, but it's so metaphysical that it's hard to talk about. But yeah. But I will think more about, I think, levels or binaries involved in national starvation. There's good literature on famine, but most beyond me. Yeah.
Alexa L has a question from online. They ask, who would have created the maps of the ghetto that you are using for your scholarship? If these are Nazi maps, I wonder what you think of using a cartographic study to describe a geography that was developed by people who did not live inside the ghetto themselves. And how are you thinking of accounting for that archival bias in your conceptualization of geography? I also wonder about the nature of hunger, and if you were just thinking that on the level of food, or if that word to you is more expansive. The Nazis starved people from their sense of humanity more holistically, and on the end of a potential for an imagined future. So I'm curious about the boundaries of what that word and where they might lie for you. Thanks so much. I love this topic as someone thinking about landscape and preservation too.
Cool. You should email me. I feel like we might have something to talk about. The map, I believe, is a planning map made by German administration. That particular map that I looked at is from the archive in Warsaw, and the legend on it is like all in German. Archival bias is definitely something that I think about. I love thinking about archives conceptually, learning out about it, I suppose. But that's actually one of the reasons that I did want to work on the Łódź Ghetto, because of this incredible archive that we do have, which is the Chronicle, which I briefly mentioned in my talk, which was a near daily bulletin of updates. Anything mundane from the population that day, the number of people who had died, it changes to ration announcements. And I hadn't realized until I started researching, but it's understood that the Germans did not know that this was being published nearly every day, if not every week, as time went on. And so it is sometimes impersonal. I think there was still a bit of caution about like opinions being laid out in the publication, but they do describe and have like almost like op-eds that I think describe how like sort of like the how the population as a whole might be feeling about certain changes or announcements. And so it is sort of like top down from the Jewish population. And that's where memoirs and testimonies for me really like fill in the gap of how people felt and remember their own places inside this like very large ghetto. And with hunger as a hungering for or hungering wishes for, I think, other types of fulfillment, I do focus on sort of like the physiological demands of biological function. To put it clinically, I think that
religion, literature, social relations are such like they're obviously a nourishing aspect necessary also for physical survival. However, I think it delves more into areas, I think in Holocaust studies about survival resistance or agency that interests me, but I think veer into a space that I think would make it impossible for me to finish my dissertation. So I err on the side of caution, even though I do take notes and make little remarks that I want to come back to.
Go for it.
Thank you so much for the talk, Christine. I had a question about your comment regarding the mission of labor, because it seems to me you're already talking about labor in some sense in regards to how people utilize food in the day-to-day, how doctors would suggest making food out of scraps. And so connecting that back to your interest in binaries, I was curious to hear more about how you're thinking about labor in terms of mass production versus daily labor that takes place in the home, how you're differentiating the two, and then relatedly, why you feel that the mission of the latter has to happen when you're already doing the prior.
Yeah. Sorry, which one was the latter? Which one was the prior?
Well, you're that you feel like you're emitting a discussion about mass production or labor when you're already talking about labor that takes place in daily life.
I guess as a shout out mostly to my former advisor, Paul Jascott, who always talks about labor, works on labor, or asks the question about where it is in work, and that voice lingers in my mind. But I think it's because labor is just so fundamental to specifically this ghetto. Why it was hermetically sealed in that regard, because they had factories on the ground. How much, because there was not the same level of like porosity of people in the ghetto and outside to gain access to food, that labor in the end mass labor became one of the only means of acquiring supplemental food. And that's so big in terms of, again, it's physiological hunger, that labor maintenance of household and individual functionings feels more ingrained to like these domestic spaces that I'm thinking about, that like this like larger area of like the outside, these specific places of mass production feel really foreign to me because they vary so much. I remember reading or looking at a testimony where somebody spoke about, I think they're working with like fur or some kind of thing, about how it was lovely in the factory in the winter because they had to like steam things, so it was really warm. And I would imagine that helped sort of like the demands on how much their body had to sort of like hold it together. But how that changes with seasons, or like, they worked in another factory that had too many windows, like how that differs so much, and then it's just, there's so much more to understand that I'm cautious about how much I take that on.
Wolf Gruner has a question.
Hi, Wolf.
Did memories of hunger change survivor narratives of certain ghetto spaces, and did different levels of access to food produce different perceptions of the same spaces in the ghetto?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, it does. It's like, I remember in the Chronicle, this is just an example that comes to mind. I don't want to mass characterize things, but some people refer to a courtyard as a space they could sleep out during the summertime because it got so hot on the upper levels of apartments. The same courtyard was a place that people felt like trapped. It was like during a roundup. In the same courtyard, I think there was even reports of like sheds, like the roof of like water or gutters being used to plant little plants whenever they could. So it's just like there's like these microcosms of different uses of spaces that like come up. I just have no idea of knowing, or I don't know if I actually care if they're the same courtyard. I just understand that these spaces are being learned and like experienced whenever possible. And the ghetto, this particular ghetto was so big that There was a testimony that I had looked at, and they were asked about the footbridge, but then they were like, "Oh, I hardly crossed it." And I would imagine it's just like they just didn't need to go that far. And it's almost like it was so tough for people who worked on the other side, especially when they were tired, to climb 3 flights of stairs, and that's all just like different levels of massive space that was the Łódź Ghetto.
Online from Darren Aller, a comment and a question. Thanks for that excellent presentation. I wondered if you know how many kitchens were in the ghetto and whether those spaces were worth exploring if you haven't already. Just one suggestion, if you have the time or interest for comparison's sake, listen to some of the Nanking Massacre's testimonies in regards to hunger. My memory of them is that hunger and lack of food was often discussed in detail.
Yeah, I actually have like a little data set of all the soup kitchens and addresses that I managed to find, and I threw them on a map. And then they also open and close at different times. So there's a question of like, does this mean anything? How does this change over time? But I didn't have like a complementary piece that I wanted to look at in connection with the soup kitchens. So I kind of, that's part of the piece that I put down. And I would also have to then map like where bread shops were, where factories were, and I think I'm always thinking about how to come back to that, but it's not something that I'm actively pursuing. And thank you for your suggestion about testimonies from another area.
Another comment from Doug Bush. They say, there is so much information in the photographs taken during this period to help you with what was offered and what was one able to receive.
Yes. I know, I can't not look at it.
Any other questions?
Could be reading this one.
Yeah, please do. Your first one was epic.
Well,
No,
sorry.
No, a lot to think about. A lot to think
Well,
about.
I mean, part of this is that I work on history of plantation economy in Guatemala,
Yeah.
and then another thing that came up for me was these very provocative, the suggestion, which I think is really powerful in history too. Like, if you can't place the courtyard, but you know that in at least one courtyard, someone had a gutter garden that was helping them survive. I think as a feature of the ghetto, it's something that you can add to a kind of the imaginary geography, which grounded in the more archivally based stuff. I think is powerful. But reminds me of no one really knows the location of all these plantation maroon gardens that slaves or indigenous people experiencing forced labor would maintain on the edges, in the very porous edges of the plantation where it meet the jungle and go out there and gather wild crops. And this is a very different world of ecology, but it's maybe an interesting comparison potentially. And final thing is I think maybe you don't need more Ponte to talk about. I think that I think one there are other people that think about the moral geography, right?
Yeah.
And you have a disciplinary geography, and then you have the constraints of biology and hunger that limit the body's capacity to be free in space. But then you have this very evocative line too about the woman who feels guilt for stealing and the man who breaks in line, and that's kind of a spatial maneuver, right? And then so where does hunger and for whom create this point where a moral, a way of being moral in space gives way to a more pragmatic survivalist impulse, and the profound the presence of that in so many testimonies of survivors of mass violence. It's kind of tension, throughout history, right? So it's but I think in such a concentrated space of the moral geography is almost as visible and felt as the disciplinary geography, right? And so it's maybe more almost material way to think about things.
Responding comments, I think of this line by Sarah Cushman where it was something like action implies, or responsibility implies agency, but it doesn't always have to be positive. And I think that applies to a lot of these moments that I encounter. And also, thinking about plantation economies, I often also think about Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, which is sort of like a work or approach to sort of filling in the blanks of historical moments or instances where the archive has a lot of blanks, and it's critical fabulation, critically not just making things up, but seeing what you do have and drawing the narrative out of that. And I often find it interesting to work on a historical circumstance that's so well documented, yet I'm still nevertheless trying to pull together filling in the blanks because I am obsessed with places like Cat.
Yeah.
But yeah, but thank you so much for your engagement.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Christine.